Hello, everybody. My name is Jasmine Gui, and I am the Education and Industry Programmer at the Toronto Relation International Film Festival. Welcome to Archive Means and Mediums, our second panel and the Real Ideas Symposium on World Building. We're really excited today to bring together a group of wonderful speakers to consider the importance of archives and memory in relation to communal visibility, access, and care. I would first like to begin by locating Relations offices on the treaty territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit and the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat nations. This territory is covered by the Dish with One Spoon Covenant, a treaty of collective responsibility for the protection and sharing of land and resources. The offices of our festival's streaming platforms are located respectively on Takaranto in Dish with One Spoon territory, and also on the unceded territories of Musqueam, the Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh on the west coast. In the space of a digital symposium, I would like to recognize the way development has historically been used to steal land and displace people, and how technology in very material forms is wielded to suppress, surveil, and inflict violence on Indigenous communities. In light of this, we hope to take up critical conversations on digital tools and digital spaces and interrogate the liberatory promises of digital futures. As we begin this panel on absent and erased histories and the power of all kinds of records, I really encourage audiences everywhere to learn and remember the histories of all the lands that we are settled on. Here on Turtle Island, we recognize the many treaty lands, agreements, unceded territories, and also the ongoing work of Indigenous leaders and communities fighting for reparations and for justice. We honor their work and we follow the lead of these Indigenous organizers, creatives, and communities that continue to give us hope, language, and possibility. For this panel, we'd like to especially thank Ontario Creates and the Canada Council for the Arts Digital Strategy Fund for their support. Just a reminder that if you're watching live from Cinesen and want to ask questions, to send it through the Cinesen chat in the Ask a Question box at the top. If you're viewing this from a phone, the chat will be at the bottom of the screen. I will now cede the time to our amazing moderator for this panel, Bo Gomez, Gallery and Programs Coordinator at Critical Distance. You can check out Bo's bio. That will be in the festival Q&A chat. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Hopefully everybody can hear me and see me properly. Thank you so much, Jasmine, for the introduction and for this wonderful opportunity to facilitate this conversation. So if I may ask to have the slides up, that would be wonderful. Okay, so today's panel will reflect on the necessities and challenges of archiving and its potential to build and foster community. So community archives are crucial in commemorating and celebrating lived experiences of Indigenous, Black, and POC families and communities. And while we haven't seen enough, and frankly still don't see enough of our stories recorded and included within greater institutions, there are collectives and initiatives within our local sphere, what I lovingly refer to as jewel boxes of collectives, that hold the important work of preserving, presenting, and keeping alive these stories in meaningful and engaging ways. So today we are joined by some of our community members who do exactly this work. And we have with us Katrina Cohen Palacios, archivist for the Homemade Visible Project. We have Vasuki Shanmuganathan, researcher, community organizer, and founder of the Tamil Archive Project, and Vince Ha, filmmaker, writer, and curator for Invisible Footprints. So I want to remind the panelists as well to speak slower in cases where the ASL interpreters might need to spell sign something or make reference to something. So thank you. So I want to start with a sort of icebreaker introductory combo question to our panelists. And in that, I want to ask, in your own words, why is an archive important? And perhaps what inspired you to work in archives and archiving? So, for example, was there like an archival piece or a show or a collection that you came across, or even a piece of writing or a video that you came across that sort of motivated you to pursue this kind of work? So,
I guess as the archivist, I can start with this. And even though it's an icebreaker, I actually found the question, why is an archive important, quite difficult. Something we maybe just assume in archive school and not actually think about. And I think archives are important because they're not only byproducts of power, but also symbols of power. So independent archives are power, evidence of power, because they provide an opportunity for self-representation. And I actually fell into archiving. I was an undergrad in history. I did an internship with oral histories and cataloging them per se. And it really made me think about the different types of records that are created, but how we can recuperate them through oral histories. So that's really what inspired me.
that's great. That's the key, or Vince?
So the reason why I started becoming interested in the archive is actually threefold. I also think that archives are both important, but also leave room to rethink how we do archives in different spaces. The first motivation is personal. I came here as a refugee. I am a displaced person because of war. And so the history of my community is one of genocide, pogroms. The biggest library / archive in my country was burned down. And so we lost a lot of our histories. And when you are in a diasporic community, those kinds of histories become even more important. The second motivation is one as a researcher. I did my dissertation on the forced displacement of colonial subjects. And I remember during one of the research trips, it was in Germany, in a city called Hamburg, which is about 2 hours outside of Berlin. And I was in this archive, and because someone had invited me and told me there were tons of postcards on colonized subjects. And when I went there, I opened this box, and what I came across were a lot of photographs of children. Children who had been forcefully migrated to Europe for various shows, and they were there on their own. And it was really important to capture those stories, as well as the emotional impact those stories have on the communities. So the motivation for Tamil Archive Project actually came out of frustration of not finding ourselves in the archives, but also more importantly, finding a space where we can decide what gets represented and how it gets represented in the archive. And not the always already colonial story of this.
Correct. And I think what you all share, as a quick note, is, communities in a way galvanizing to shift that control and shift that authorship to be able to celebrate also and commemorate these experiences. So Vince, do you want to add to that?
I think for me, I feel like archiving is a collective documenting, but it's also a collective distortion. And until we really understand the biases or the system that create these kind of biases, we don't really, we can't really have an honest reflection of who we are and where we are as community or as individuals. And then for me, my motivation for working with archives, I think it's a personal journey. In 2009, one of my best friend died in a car accident, and it was a drunk driver. He was going 200 in a 50 zone, and I mean, his car shredded my friend's van, which included her aunt, her mother, and left her father in injured, and he's still living with those kind of injuries. And during that time, I had a very tough time dealing with grief. It took me about like 8 or 9 years to really process the whole cycle of grief. And everywhere I go, I would see newspapers and reporters trying to contact us to kind of get this, and more information about their families and things like that. But during that time, I had another friend. Her name is Lynn. She would collect all of these kind of newspaper articles and start making journals and scrapbooks. And at that time, I really didn't understand her process. I had a very time coping with it, but over the years, I've learned to really embrace those scrapbooks and what it meant for me personally. And it kind of that was the spark to kind of lead me into working with archives. But I also want to preface that I'm not an archivist. I feel like I am more of an outsider. I'm an artist who works with archive, who's interested in archiving. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Oh, thank you for sharing. I think there's also something so kind of beautiful in the tactility and immediacy of documents in a way, and you get to experience that in a certain way. And I think like that's what can be so powerful with an archive, and especially the kind of community that it can bring together. Thank you all for sharing, your sort of personal kind of anecdotes about your pursuit of archival work. So in doing my research for this panel, I found that there were, the 3 emerging themes or 3 shared themes that I thought that collectively shape your mandates and your initiatives. And I thought I would sort of, talk them through this way today. And I wanted to start with visibility, how an archive should be public, or archive as a means to, as I said before, preserve, commemorate, and celebrate these stories. So looking at Homemade Visible with Katrina, there is a quote that I included in your slide, and I found it to be very compelling. And I'm going to read it really quickly. So much of the stories that are told about Indigenous and visible minorities are about adversity, and those are important stories to tell. What is also important is the strength, the flair, the play, the joy that makes up who we are. And home movies are a great way to remember that. And that was stated by Ananya Ori, who's the artistic director of Homemade Visible. So Katrina, can you maybe speak on, how do you go about balancing recognizing adversity and celebrating livelihood?
Yes, I absolutely love this quote from Ananya, and I'm so happy you included it. Archiving and preserving Homemade Visible came at a very interesting time in my career, in that I was a contract archivist, but I was also preserving the records of many community organizers and anti-racist activists, such as Jean Augustine, Beverly Salmon, and Carl James. And so it actually, going through all those records of adversity really weighed down on me. And working with Homemade Visible, seeing all the joy, seeing the everyday life. And I think for the first time with the Marchant family videos, who's a Latinx family, it was the first time I'd actually seen someone who looked like someone from my family within the archives. So that was a very special moment, and maybe why that family's records are maybe my favorite. Visibility is a tough thing, especially with it being a predominantly white profession. 7% of professional archivists are BIPOC. We see a ton of artists, BIPOC artists, working with archival records. And we really want to sort of bring everyone in, whether you're a professional archivist or a community archivist or an activist. There's this interdisciplinary of archival records that is important for access. And we're, as part of the Archives Association of Ontario, we're trying to create these safe spaces for BIPOC archivists or all those who work with records to kind of come together so that we can work on preserving, but also providing access to these records.
And thank you, Katrina. And I remember attending one of the sessions for the BIPOC archivist session events, and it was so illuminating because it really hit on, you know, this notion of positionality with archiving and what it means to present work through an institution and who is, you know, distributing them and disseminating them. Vince, I also took a quote from, I think, the very first program booklet that you had for the exhibition for Invisible Footprints. And it speaks on sort of presenting, you know, queer Asian stories in all its nuances and complexities. And I actually wanted to read a quick quote as well. It's a little bit too small to read out in this PDF, but you mentioned how, or the document mentions how official documents of queer Asian histories serve to legitimize people's contributions, struggle, and existence. But much of, you know, our histories are recorded only in collective memories and experiences and in what they have made possible. So gatherings over dim sum, movements galvanized in living rooms, loved ones brought together by shared pains and triumphs, collective liberation on dance floors, stages, and behind karaoke mics. These moments, along with the officious documented milestones, constitute queer Asian histories in the city. And I thought that was really, really compelling. So can you perhaps expand on your process and how do you navigate presenting these experiences in both critical and celebratory ways?
I think whenever we talk about visibility, I think that we have to talk more than just visibility. When we were doing our research, especially during the 80s and 90s for queer Asian men specifically, there were a lot of stereotypes about queer Asian men as being effeminate. So what happens is that we end up creating these counter imagery of, like, you know, the gym bunnies. Like if you notice, like the first queer, the first Pride parade that gay Asian men led, you know, we had all of these really buff Asian men leading the parade. I think that in itself can be a danger when we try to create these kind of false dichotomies. So I think when we talk about visibility, we need an informed visibility, one that can be constantly calibrated, and I think one that can suggest what's beyond what's invisible, like what's visible. And like you said, I think there's so much in the queer community that's not visible, that we're suggesting to that, right? Yeah, so I'm not sure if I answered your question.
No, you have. No, absolutely. And I think like that's important because, you know, we, like our communities, you know, a lot of our experiences are enriched through our gatherings in all different varieties. And sometimes, like, how do we go about, you know, in a way, preserving this and show it? And I think like what's been recorded through history has always been, in a way, like our differences and our otherness. And I think like when, you know, but what we have is the strength in like our sort of kinship and camaraderie that have existed really like for a very, very long time. And I think balancing that with, you know, the contributions and the struggles that we've sort of put forth is a great way to kind of show that complexity and hopefully show both, you know, what has been visible and what is still invisible. So moving forward, I really found the phrase archiving communal affect as provided by Vasuki really pertinent in this conversation. And Vasuki, if you can, you know, open up the discussion a bit on what that means for the Tamil Muslim community and what has the Tamil Archive Project done to maintain these conversations and maintain the story of the legacy of storytelling.
Mm-hmm. So there are some points I want to make about visibility, because not everybody has the privilege to have their history told or their story told. And a good example, just to follow up with Vince, is, for instance, Tamil queer histories or queer histories of other racialized communities. There is this impetus in us to document, to showcase that those histories are also histories of joy. And in the same breath, you have to think about the consequences. So will this have repercussions for the person to be in the archive? Are we comfortable with that person containing their own history and not sharing it with anybody else? So that's one. Two, we also strongly believe that we should be responsible for all racialized communities' histories and upholding them, so that our exercise in privileging our history doesn't become the erasure of other histories. A great example of this is not just what is going on in the slides, which I will get to in a second, but also thinking about the mundane and why the mundane is important to us and also other racialized communities. And for us, the mundane is the space in which we can offer critique. So what kinds of histories are excluded or who doesn't get to be part of the archive? The mundane is also a way to showcase that our survival, our presence is just as important. We don't need immense amount of trauma in order to qualify to be in the archive. That isn't the only aspect to ourselves. And then the other part of this is I'm also not a trained archivist. I work with archives as a researcher. And this is also a freeing thought to us in the collective, because we thought about, well, what are things that aren't archived as much? And so the video that, the screenshot that you see was a collective performance. And so there were prompts about joy, care, and love. And during one of the workshops, which was Touch and Flesh, led by Brennavi, she asked members, participants, to show where on their body such emotions are located. And so it combines sort of the archival and arts practices in such a beautiful way during a time where everybody needed that communal space. Actually, we always need that communal space.
And I think this is the the opportunity and the circumstance, or I suppose, yeah, the time, like when we can come together and critically think about our experiences too. And I think this is very much an important aspect of understanding, a more holistic perspective of our experiences, both in the struggles and in our triumphs. So thank you. That was very illuminating. So in light of I guess before I move on to the next next slide, I wanted to ask you folks, what are some evolving challenges you encounter with archiving content that has been historically ignored or excluded from formalized or institutional archive structures? Is anybody going to take a stab on that?
This is something I encountered a lot with the Homemade Visible project as an archivist employed by York University, and at the time a contract archivist employed by York University, working with Homemade Visible. And I think a big issue is the power dynamics that exist between artists, independent archives, or just individual donors coming to an institutional archive. And often when you're talking about everyday people, such as those represented in Homemade Visible, they may not know what they can ask for or what restrictions they can impose, or that you can demand a tax receipt for your donation at York University, for example. And if you don't have someone telling you this or advocating this on your behalf, it can be quite difficult. Not only that, but as I'd mentioned, with such a white profession, descriptive practices are incredibly difficult. You have, you know, even me as a Latinx archivist, I do not know all the languages. I am not aware of all the cultural practices. And this is where with Homemade Visible, a lot of the labor was placed onto the donors and the project coordinators, such as Ananya and Elizabeth Mayuni, because of how much work had to be done to describe these records appropriately and to represent properly represent what was embedded within those records. So that can all be very difficult, as well as I think within institutional archives, BIPOC communities are often grouped as a monolith. And as Vasuki and Vince have noted, you know, there are a variety of communities and diversity within, you know, certain cultural groups or ethnicities that we need to be made aware of, whether it's LGBTQ, those with disabilities, many things that we can't just say at York University, well, we have a strength in BIPOC communities, because what is that, right? Like, let's say, which I don't know the number, we have 25% of our holdings are BIPOC. Well, that's not fully representing any of those communities per se. And even with Homemade Visible, I think we had a very low number of Indigenous submissions. And I think a big part of that is trust of the archives, which, you know, I don't think institutional archives always or fully deserve that trust. So that's something that can be very difficult with institutional archives, and something I grapple with as someone employed by an institutional archive.
Vasuki or Vince, you have anything to add to that?
I think one of the thing that I want to add is that documents and artifacts have coded emotions and energy. And I find that often institutional archive don't have the context to really unlock those emotions and energy. And what happens is sometimes what gets coded at the institutional archive gets echoed more so than the sharing and the context provided from communities, because we don't have the same kind of structure or resources that has that kind of reach. And I really love what Vasuki said about the mundane. Often institutional archives don't know what to do with the mundane. And we lose a lot of stories that are nuanced, that are often not included.
This is a really great question, because as much as I'm for creating archives within racialized communities, I'm constantly struggling with this issue of why is it that people in racialized communities have to apply for specialized funding in order to build these archives? Why is it that we have specialized months to showcase certain histories versus if you go into a mainstream traditional archive, you see mostly white history reflected, and it's seen as a default. This is what we are including. There's no questions about funding for those spaces. And so having to constantly qualify myself and also other people who are racialized to be in those archives or to be worthy to be archived is a really conflicting conversation. So I do, on the one hand, thoroughly enjoy the fact that we have this wonderful collective of people who are doing archival practices through creative teams. And on the other side, I'm constantly wondering, so when do we get to be included in these archives? Or should we take down these archives? The other thing that I also want to echo is just something that was mentioned before is it's very hard also within a racialized community to get away from a certain monolithic image, or also known as this model minority image. And a lot of people in the Tamil community struggle with that. So there's a particular representation that proliferates in the media or within the community, and having more critical conversations is so important. Also, so even if you're outside of institutional structures, where these questions might be asked. So we in the collective try to be mindful, for instance, of the differences of who gets access, who gets visibility, that's defined by caste, by location, by socioeconomic status. And also, what do you do if you have no objects for the archive?
Mm-hmm.
Can I also, sorry.
No, go on. Go ahead.
Good. Can I also add to some of the points that we're talking about institutional archive? From my personal experience, some of the archives that I work with, some of their projects are community volunteer led, and they're lacking a ton of resources as well. For the projects that they want to do, or they don't have the network to reach out to certain communities. So sometimes the challenge is also getting away from that initial, the initial assumption that we have about these archives and why they're perpetuating a certain type of stories. And like I said, they themselves are also lacking resources to deal with a more complex or a nuanced way of portraying these stories.
Agreed.
And I think,
sorry, go ahead.
Just sorry, to add to that with resources, especially at an institutional such as mine at York University, I think working and properly representing and properly describing and properly compensating individuals for the Homemade Visible projects, we and I say Elizabeth and Ananya, interviewed the donors. There was a lot of back and forths that I would not have been able to do. And so Homemade Visible really took on that aspect for our institution, or they did it and then donated it to us. And I think that's something where the diversity in the profession is also needed. And just resources in general, you know, in the arts or in archives is, we all need funding. And we're all doing the best that we can sometimes, I think.
Thank you. And I think it's a sheer reminder that, you know, that the diversity is, you know, really, it's the people and not necessarily the records. And we find that the reality is, you know, Canadian archiving, the Canadian archiving scene, they don't really represent BIPOC, marginalized and low-income communities in a way that they should. And that's why it goes back to what Katrina was saying about the importance of BIPOC archivists, in that, you know, the diversity in the archive and the archiving community means diversifying and meaningfully diversifying these records as well. And, you know, reality is, you know, white archivists could bear a very different positionality. And, you know, what does it mean for the social capital of it all to sort of like gear towards white archive? And in a way, keeping this in mind, archiving efforts by institutions, and especially like, you know, white dominated institutions are deemed as in a way community work. And, you know, at times, you know, the inclusion of BIPOC content can be based on the ideas of perhaps like a white archiving body. So I think that's really important to keep, you know, this types of positionalities in mind, and especially like who gets the credit, and, you know, how these agreements with the donors and the resource providers take place. So thank you all for sharing your insights on these evolving challenges. I'd like to move on to our next slide. So it's actually a great segue into our next theme, which is about access and accessibility. So, I think it's important to recognize that, archiving practices is a responsibility and that we are accountable because our communities that we're serving are still at stake. And I would like to now sort of kind of turn the tables on you folks to speak about the actual processes and practices that you pursue and that you do within your collectives. And in a way, also keeping in mind this question, which is, where does an archive draw the line between access and restriction while ensuring that your resources remain non-prescriptive and inclusive? And I think in a way, we've sort of covered that a little bit in the previous question. So Vasuki, I know that a big portion of your archival methods are based on your digital publications, such as the Tamil Futures magazine, and as well a new series that you're working on called the Tamil Artist Series. So could you perhaps expand on that?
Yes, thank you for mentioning those two projects. Tamil Futures came out of the acknowledgement that diasporic experiences, particularly of Sri Lankan Tamil people, but also everybody else who identifies as Tamil, are vast and different. And also we're located in all different parts of the world. And so Tamil Futures became a way for us to pose some really critical questions and have a collection of stories that we were able to share with other people around globally. And so what started out as this sort of afternoon of thinking about how do we archive stories and make them accessible ended up being this publication. And 2021 is coming out next year as well. And so we're very happy that also the team was able to continue this mode of archiving. The second part is an artist series. We have actually quite a lot of projects, but I'm highlighting these two because these are projects that we are on the go at the moment. The Tamil Artist Series was a way for us to document artists in our community. Oftentimes, racialized artists are hard to find. So when you Google artists, Canadian artists, the images that might come up aren't maybe reflective of the community that you're looking for, or aren't maybe reflective of the kinds of projects that you want to do. And so we were trying to figure out ways of having an archive that allows for artists to not just document their thoughts on what the future of art is, what their own personal relationship is to Tamil identity, but also some of their work. Because where I'm from, a lot of that is usually passed down communally through oral histories or members sharing stories. And because we're in the diaspora and because the locations are different, this is one way in which we can also globally share this. And just to add a small note about accessibility, I think anytime you make an archive, it's already exclusionary because it's either a person or a set of people who are determining what story gets included or what is cohesive or what makes sense at that moment. So this collective is very much aware that we will probably make mistakes. And I think the responsibility part, the accountability part is so important. We are also currently part of an incubator. Shout out to Codes of Contacts, Atif and Nazma, who are very much looking at this question of accessibility, especially in the digital realm, and how we can make those more accessible to everybody in the community.
Katrina Revins? Oh, sorry. I didn't realize that I was on my slide. All right, so Katrina this time, my apologies. So I took a screenshot of the current online database and directory of the Digitizing Archive videos and films. And it's actually, I thought, a very well put together page that lists all of the home movies, some of which are available if you go to the link. So can you talk about the process? You kind of covered this a little bit before, but can you talk about the process of, again, sort of compiling all of these films and the digitization of them and putting them together into this one sort of online registry?
Sure. I will put the disclaimer, though, that I was not involved with any of this work. It was all the work of Elizabeth and Ananya and Charles Street Video as our the Homemade Visible partner as well, who did all the digitization, the editing, the selecting, the talking with the donors. And at York University, we acquired the product of all the output of all that work and are in charge of preserving and providing access to it in perpetuity. And I say in perpetuity because, to my knowledge and my understanding, the grant funding for this project paid for this website to be up for about 5 years. So after 5 years, this website may actually disappear, and the only access to it would be through York University, through our digital repository, our digital library, and any sort of analog means, because there were some analog materials that were donated to us, including 8mm film. And so the whole process, it was about a 2-year process where there was a call out for submissions through media, through word of mouth. People heard about it. I believe, I think there was about 80 people who selected to participate or indicated interest, and 36 families in the end did participate, those that were eligible as well as those that agreed to the terms of participation. And so a really interesting aspect of the project was families could digitize 5 media carriers, and they would, in exchange for doing this for free, where film can be very expensive to scan and digitize, they were asked to donate 5 minutes of their home movies to York University. And what's really interesting is the variety of choices people made in donating their material. Some people chose only to provide footage that did not include their family members. So say family vacations, and you could see Niagara Lake and the CN Tower or somewhere in London to protect the privacy of their family. And then other families chose to donate the entire VHS cassette, a digitized VHS cassette tape, 2 hours of, say, a family party where you could see everyone celebrating, having fun, etc. And so there was a great variety in the choices that people made and how they wanted to usurp and sort of subvert sort of the framework of the project that required this donation aspect. And there was a lot of back and forth with the families, interviewing to find out the contents of the family videos, the home videos, because so much of what we could see, as an archivist, I can only extract so much information from the videos, but people can then embed their own personal memories, such as this is the last footage taken of a family member who passed away, or this footage sparked a memory, and sort of added this evidentiary nature to the home movies. So the donations ended up being not just footage of home movies, but these oral histories that some were directly related and others not so directly related to the home movies. So it was quite incredible. And so compiling that all, it all came to York University, and we've put it up online. I'm hopefully this week just going to finish processing all 300 video clips. But even since we started processing it all, we've had a number of donors request access, and we'll be talking with the families to providing open access if that's desired, because right now they're behind a login screen, so people have to request access to see those videos.
Thank you, Katrina. I also wanted to kind of quickly give a heads up on a link has been sent for the Tamil Artist Series on the chat, so please check it out when you can. And also do check out the current issue of the Tamil Futures magazine. I've given it a read and it's rather compelling, so thank you for sharing those, Vasuki. And as well, the link for the Homemade Visible Home movie was just shared on the chat as well, so do check it out when you can. So moving forward, Vince, I'd like to sort of pick your brain on Invisible Footprints and the process of partnering with arts establishments or institutions in presenting, the show or presenting an archive in this way. So can you perhaps talk to us about, I think the most recent symposium and video screening that you put together, I believe, was it around February of this year?
Yeah, I also want to give a shout out to the organizer for the Invisible Footprints 0.3, which is Anse and Ron Siu, with the support of Aries Chang and various other educators and community members. I think Invisible Footprint had a very meandering path. I think we started with the idea, I would say late 2015, start reaching out to community members with their private collection, and then we halted the process because at that point it was just an idea. We didn't have any funding to do anything. And then so we took and of course at that time I was still in school doing my master's, so I couldn't devote so much time. So it wasn't until maybe about 8 months later where we secured the funding. And then we start reaching out to get more institutional support from other organizations. But most of the support that we have is mainly just community members with their private collection and their generosity in terms of how they care for the material. So everything for us is on loan. And for us, when we're doing Invisible Footprint, it wasn't so much of the product of what the artists create. That wasn't our benchmark for success, but it was so much of how do the community build relationship with each other, especially the younger artists and some of the activists or community members who are assisting them in creating that kind of work. And I think it's kind of challenging when you're working in this type of process or in this type of community. So I always kind of like scale it down as if like we are a small group of survivors on an island. Like that's the analogy that I always use. That sometimes an artist is more of a scout or a messenger. But when we move as a collective, sometimes we can't take the same kind of risk as an individual would take. So it's necessary risk when we do take it, but it's a reflected risk. And I remember Amanda, who's one of the artists that was part of the Invisible Footprint 0.3, who has her short film in this year's Real Asian Film Festival, is that I remember we were in a taxi. It was last year's Real Asians launch party, and we were in a taxi, and she was sharing that she's having a difficult time finding a foothold of what she wants to express. And I think as we continue to talk, I share with her that, the best thing that you could focus on is just the relationship that you have with the people you're working with right now. And whatever you produce, it doesn't really matter. At the end of the day, it really doesn't matter.
That was so good. I loved hearing that. I think, again, it brings back the importance of, meaningful community building. And I think this is what all of you folks, all of your organizations have done as well. So, and especially as we get to, our last theme, we will cover so much about, archiving as this experience and how meaningful that could be in terms of fostering community abundance and community survival, really. Thank you. So just segueing from that sort of exhibition process, I kind of quickly wanted to talk about what we do here at Critical Distance Center for Curators, which is in a way kind of preserving the experience of exhibitions through our catalog archiving. And it's been such a core priority that we do here at Critical Distance because, again, it really talks about or it's sort of like a process of bringing access in a way that perhaps people will not have in terms of being on site and experiencing the exhibition on a sort of physical matter. And what's been so kind of instrumental in putting our catalog program together is it's serving as a valuable service to our artists and curators because it is an opportunity for them to be published and really sort of value and highlight the work that curators do. And also like have this documentation available to future researchers. And I think through that, like a lot of networking opportunities can take place and even more conversations can take place. But agreed, a big challenge with this is funding as well and seeking partnerships through the publishing process that could help us. And there's always going to be production, distribution, logistics that, can cause challenges along the way. But we understand and really, see the value of sort of preserving these exhibitions in a way that is well documented, in the way that people can access publicly as well. So I think, a big part of our core framework is always, navigating how to not restrict and how to make these resources as accessible as possible. So I would like to move on and ask this question because I think it's important in light of our current pandemic situation. I think it rings even more true. So what do you think digital or digitized archivals offer in possibility and what might it compromise?
I think the pandemic certainly changed the way that we approach the archive. A lot of what we do at the Tamil Archive Project is communally based and in-person events and building relationships on the ground. And having to shift to the digital space was quite difficult because we ended up focusing actually a lot more intensely on making sure our collective members were okay. We had more check-ins. We used our meetings to just hang out with each other. And so making sure that the sustainability of the collective members is always our priority was important. And then in terms of digitizing archival material, not only were we able to become creative, but it also brought up really interesting questions about will what we currently create be accessible? So what if technology moves on and is no longer able to access what we currently have? But I also want to give the other panelists time. Sorry. That's just my initial thoughts on this.
I think I want to echo what Vasuki is saying in that, archival research or archival work is privileged. Most archives are only open Monday to Friday, 9 to 5 when people are working. And so digital or digitized records provide broader access and, reduces the financial burden to travel to an archive if you must. But the issue with digitizing records or that archives can't digitize everything is how resource intensive digital preservation can be, not just in the costs to digitize, but also the tremendous costs it takes to preserve or host material online. And I'll just say that as a very short answer.
I think some of the benefit for a digital or a digitalized archive would be the reach. But often what I see is that when it comes to digital material, it then kind of overshadows the original material, and sometimes we can overlook or disregard the original material. And especially with community projects, we don't really have the resources to care properly, professionally for original content. And currently, right now, I'm working on a project called Water Lullabies, and it's about the Vietnamese diaspora. And when we were supposed to have our show in April, but then the pandemic hit. And what happened was there's this rush of everybody's wanting the content to be online, right? But the major issue is that, you know, a large portion of our community members are elders. And the technology completely makes it inaccessible for them. You know, and these are people who are older than my parents. And, you know, the only way that I can reach them is if I go over to their house or I would give them a call, right? And I feel like, especially with digital archiving and digitalized content at the moment, especially at the earlier front of the pandemic, is that I think there was a wave of people doing digitalized content. And I often have a conversation and compare it to the people who kind of like overbuy toilet paper and Lysol wipes and kind of resell it at a higher price. You know, we take those instances as an example out for criticism, but often when it comes to the arts or the cultural scene, and we see those kind of cases, we don't really give a critical lens to it, right? Especially some of the content. What does it mean to have imagery and content as an immediate response? There's a benefit to it, but there's also a cost to it, and often there's damaging imagery that comes along with that, especially with the Vietnamese community and some of the racism that's involved, especially early onset of the pandemic.
I think Vasuki sort of coined it perfectly in terms of sustaining our community members, because we have to sort of look at it holistically in terms of like, how do we make sure that, you know, we are looking out on all aspects, which in a lot of ways, you know, the digital kind of sphere can have boundaries with. So thank you all for sharing your insights on that. I'd like to take this opportunity for us to take a 5-minute break so people can kind of, you know, breathe out a little bit and space out a little bit what they need. So thank you all, and hopefully everybody, you know, sticks around, and we have one more very, very juicy, substantial theme coming up. So thank you. All right, everybody. So we are back, and we're going to jump right into our last theme, which is about community and care. And as we have all sort of discussed already, I think it's such a crucial part of these organizations' archiving practices to experience archive as a dialogue and archive as a way to open up conversations, and archive as a foundation for collective care. And so I would happily and excitedly want to pick everybody's brains on the scope of what they do as an extension past perhaps like what a traditional or standard archiving practice would be. So a quick question that I have sort of put together to encompass all of this is, how do these archiving practices and or engagement initiatives help reinforce this community, the sense of community survival and abundance that is so important in part of, that responsibility. So let's start with Tamil Archive Project, and really appreciate the slide. Really, this notion of like, what does it mean to bring back care as a communal responsibility? So perhaps Vasuki, can you speak a little bit about the Dinner for One series and the Healing Arts Dinner Circle as well, if you can?
Yes, thank you for highlighting this project as well. This is Dinner for One through Koffler Digital. Feel free to check it out. It's a video that is still online. So if you go to Koffler Digital, you'll find it there. This was filmed with the community fellows. Most of them are on here. We have 10 of them, and they're part of the Healing Arts Dinner Circle, which is funded by the Ontario Trillium Foundation. So shout out to them for supporting us on this as well. And the premise of this was bringing people from racialized communities together to talk about themes of trauma and survival through a shared meal, through looking at arts, and also using it as a platform to highlight racialized artists in the community so that more people have become aware of them. Secondly, the cross-community collaboration was extremely important to us, so that it isn't just the Tamil community in isolation doing this, but all different racialized communities coming together, because these are the neighborhoods in which we live in. And so Dinner for One was thought of as, we can't do these dinners anymore. And so how do we document those experiences? How do we come together and share a meal? And the interesting part, or the reasoning behind this video performance, is also what we actually discussed during the dinner is not part of the video. So the video has no sound. And we each wrote texts that could be part of the video installation itself. And also shout out to Yasmin for putting this together. What was important to us is, oftentimes when we have racialized communities getting together, the question is always, who's your audience? And so we didn't want what we were discussing within the dinner to become a sort of performative experience that the audience could partake in, but rather you're looking in on our dinner. And it was just the visuals that were displayed and then texts at the bottom. And so this is what, for us, this part of communal care was. I also want to make the distinction between collective versus communal care. Collective care is a group of people sharing a similar goal or value in how to be caring. And that is important. For us, we prefer the term communal, just because it is, you share the care. So the care belongs to everyone. It isn't a right, or it isn't anything else that you have to qualify yourself for. And so it became a little bit more comfortable to use that term versus collective. So we are a collective of people with different experiences who've come together. But when it comes to important emotions such as joy and feeling abundant and feeling nourished, care is something that is pretty much a non-negotiable.
Yes, thank you for that delineation. Yeah, that sort of brings me to. Oh, actually, yeah, I included the slide with all of the amazing team that put together the different initiatives that you folks have. Maybe like I'll find a way to share this to the chat if I could. But if you can go to the Tribal Artist Projects website, you can definitely check it out as well there. So thank you.
Thank you so much. I just want to give a shout out to all 35 members who are part of this collective and that I'm speaking on behalf of. And this collective would not be possible without their work. So thank you.
Thank you. And again, I wanted to segue into, part of that sort of collective / communal care is, building opportunities for conversations, especially reflecting on and addressing issues around, important curatorial practices. And I think that's another one of the important aspects that we do here at the gallery as well. And recently we have implemented an online event series that encourage these types of collective learning opportunities. And we have recently hosted and facilitated a series called Public Displays of Affection, which is a programming initiative that explores creative possibilities in accessible arts publishing. And like I said, it is a collective learning opportunity that considers the pleasures, desires, and disruptions of making arts publishing initiatives more accessible. So through that, we host conversations, workshops, and case studies on topics such as audio description and plain language, moving things to digital platforms, ASL translation. And I think this kind of brings it back to, the factoring in critical ways in which we make, the archiving process and narratives as accessible as possible. And that's very much a part of the inquiry that we pursue in our organization. And in a way, this expands the archive, as I was mentioning earlier, an archive is a dialogue. It becomes, in a way, the sort of participatory archiving. And, that sort of exchange of ideas and thoughts and thinking about things critically and recording that accordingly is very much an important anchor in our framework here. So in connecting to that, I wanted to pick Vince's brain on the projects and initiatives that you have put together with Invisible Footprints that enable these opportunities for open dialogue, especially between generations. So can you perhaps illuminate us a little bit more on that?
I also just want to share a bit of my thought about care as we talk about archiving as care. I think it's a journey that I'm still learning. I'm with my partner for 12 years. I'm still learning how to care for my partner. My parents are aging. I'm still learning how to care for my parents. And I think when we do these type of projects, we're also learning how to care for each other in a communal setting. And more than just the collective responsibility of caring, I think there's also individual responsibility of caring. Especially in communities like the Queer Asian communities. It's a smaller community and our actions impact each other more. Our words impact each other more. So I think that there is a care that's necessary when it comes to our action and our words. And it's important to remind the community of that as well. So I think, for example, with the Invisible Footprints, especially the first one, when we say invisible footprint, we weren't just talking about the narratives of queer Asian and reflect to the larger queer stories, but we're also being critical about the stories that's missing from within our own communities. Like especially early 80s and 90s, we have a lot of stories and documents that were made, and it's often made by cis gay men who are, who came from Hong Kong. And simply the reason was that, like other immigrants, Vietnamese, Thai, or Filipino immigrants at that time, perhaps we didn't come with the resources or the education background or the positionality that others had. So those we didn't have those kind of documents. So Invisible Footprint was a way to kind of open that up for the community to kind of look for those blind spots and blank spots and have conversation, like honest conversation about it. And often they're difficult conversations to have. So I think the care is, how do we hold a space so that we can have these difficult conversations, right? I think Real Asian did a very great job when we're trying to talk about racism or anti-Blackness within the Asian community, and we shy away from it. And it's extremely difficult to kind of bring that out in the Asian community. How can we do it safely? And especially to do it in a multi-generational setting is extremely difficult. Like at the moment I'm working in Water Lullabies, we have 4 different Vietnamese generations sitting at the table. That's 4 different ways of living, looking at the world. How do we get everyone to sit, share, respect one another, diffuse that kind of power dynamics? Especially in Vietnamese, we have hierarchy of how we refer to our elders. So there's already an automatic structure of power, right? So like, how do we diffuse that? How do we share strategies of resiliency? Especially with queer Asian community, we have such creative ways of dealing with traumas that I just feel like, I think our task was just creating opportunities for people to share that kind of knowledge.
That is great. Ringing in my head, the phrase sharing strategies of resiliency. I think it's really, really important. It's such a part of, in a way, our community survival too. So thank you. I also would like to have Katrina illuminate us on Homemade Visible's nationwide tour. I have here a press clipping that speaks on this particular initiative, and sort of putting forth the experience of the archive through a personal lens in the form of exhibition screenings and workshops. So Katrina, can you talk a little bit more on the process of doing this, and like perhaps the response even that have accumulated through this, I guess, countrywide event?
Yeah, I think one of the really great things that came out of the Homemade Visible project, which was organized by the Regent Park Film Festival, was this nationwide engagement with archival records, right? So far, I've only really talked about the donation of home movies, but that was just a third of the project. The first, well, they were concurrent phases, but the first phase there we go. 6 films by BIPOC artists, and then also this nationwide tour where people not only engaged with the films, but also a selection of home movies, and they participated in workshops such as zine making, creating postcards, and sort of the Homemade Visible project sparked this conversation about, engaging with archives, but also creating your own archives. And I think because so many people have never either stepped foot in an archive or even really thought about their own personal records or the records of their community, I think that will be the biggest legacy of this project, because it sort of went across so many different communities, and not only was not just focused in Toronto, but across the nation. And I think that's a really fantastic part of it. But with that, because it was a term project for 2 years, it's sort of, I hope to be a catalyst, not only across all these various communities and inspiring people to take action, but also a catalyst within the professional archive community. And I think it came at a really great time when this new generation of archivists who graduated from the Faculty of Information at the University of Toronto created a collective, the Diversity Working Group. And they actually were the first ones that created our first gathering of BIPOC archivists across Canada. And so what I'm really trying to do in this community care is, now that I am in a privileged position of being permanently hired somewhere, is sort of just providing platforms and amplifying the voices of this new generation of archivists who are really changing the way we think about archives and how we engage in the practice, and in myself unpacking the way I was educated and the way I work and engage with archives myself.
And I think that kind of circles back into how and why all of your organizations, collectives are such jewel boxes, because I think this brings us into recognizing the kind of creativity and lateral way of thinking in the way that we approach archival bodies. And most importantly, having meaningful, engaged conversations with the very communities that we're serving. So thank you all. Thank you all for sharing your thoughts and your insights on that. And with that, I think my slide here is a bit skewed, but I think on that note, I thought that was a really good place to end this conversation. And I will hopefully send in the chat all the links if you want to check out more information for each of our panelists, organizations, and collectives today. And we should head into some audience questions, if that's okay. Great. So one question from the audience for you panelists is, in thinking about community defined outside of a single identity frame, do you all think about archives across communities and ways of fostering across archives of people, and to do that with care?
Yes, is the short answer. What in particular, we've been really we've been taking a more careful and slow approach to ensuring that histories of collaboration against oppression are highlighted. And so there's 2-3 instances that we've taken this approach. One was the Gardiner Expressway protests in 2009. And this was at the height of when the genocide back home was going on, and people here were protesting. And what we noticed is, in traditional format, you would say who of the Tamil community here was engaged in these protests. But our approach to this project is actually, every time there's been injustice, racialized communities have come together. And so how do we document people from the racialized community coming together against oppression in these moments, and highlight them as histories that need to be told, not just in the codified version of through the media, which was in the past depicting racialized youth, for instance, in a criminalized way for protesting in the streets. And you can see this, this historical narrative of progress when you look at so-called white history, where you have, oh, and these people took to the streets and they changed the laws, and look how awesome we have it here. And then you have the same narrative or the same set of events happening with racialized youth, and that interpretation is quite different. You can see that as a prime example of that is also the important work that Black Lives Matter has done. And so we want to also use these kinds of moments as educational moments for the rest of the community around anti-Asian racism, anti-Blackness, anti-indigeneity, and anti-caste, casteism, and how that manifests within our community. Yeah, so that's just one of the examples that I wanted to highlight, but there's many more.
Did anybody else wanted to add to that?
I think within the professional archive community, we're looking more and more at, or not looking, but moving more and more towards a form of post-custodialism with archives. So not the institutional archive holding the custody of records, but how archivists engage with independent archives to provide consulting advice. That way the records really stay within the community and within those that really want to engage and work with the archives. And you see this a lot in the States, but a growing number of collectives here in Canada as well. And in the States, you have the Blacktivists, which are a collective of Black archivists working together towards helping various records either move into institutional archives or, be cared for within their communities. There's also archivist activists, which is a collective as well, where various groups can call upon these archivists for assistance. And I think a big part of it archivists can help with is how to document protests and scrub images of the protesters so that there's not retaliatory actions towards protesters, right? And so sort of how can we use the strengths of these various disciplines or professional groups to improve the records that we have and the power of those records.
I think the question was about archiving outside of a single identity frame. And from my experience, because most of my work has been from more of a personal perspective, so it kind of, there are some intersections, but it's often just related to more kind of a personal lens. But the thing that I see about maybe moving across communities would be there's a danger to talking about similarities of these communities. And then if we don't talk about the similarities, then we end up talking about their differences. And I find that when you're trying to talk about multiple communities, it's difficult to have the depth that's necessary, the research that's needed. So I don't know about. I think that I'm still trying to find or still trying to explore is that this idea of intersections and how far can you go until it gets to the point where the work is no longer honest and it feels diluted.
I think it's important to recognize, when we consider intersectionality, in that we don't compromise, the individuals and the groups that we are, in a way, attempting to include, especially, if it's coming from or it's within the periphery of a single identity frame. And I think that's an important part of this conversation in terms of like, how do we expand meaningfully, and how do we sort of like branch out, within and past these conversations in a way that includes people with care again and with sustaining their positions and their stories and their experiences. I think we are out of time, so I think that should be a good note to end. I really am fully grateful for Real Asian and for all you panelists, Katrina, Vasaki, and Vince, for sharing your insights and the work and the challenges and the nuances and complexities of archiving and archival work and expanding the conversations around it and how much work still needs to be done. But y'all are my heroes, so thank you for sharing. And Jess.
Thank you both.
Thank you all so much for this conversation. Thank you, Bo. Thank you, Katrina. Thank you, Vasaki and Vince. It was such a tender and necessary conversation. I think so many of us just learned a lot. Also like to thank Jamie and Christopher from Toronto Sign Language Interpreter Services. Thank you, Atif, for back-end support. Thank you to our tech producers, Mimi and Joe. Thank you to all the audience for sticking it out for the 90 minutes. It was really long, but also felt like it went by super fast. Just a reminder that Real Asian has amazing programming up till November 19th. this panel will be recorded and available as well. You can check out other amazing films, Q&As, and panels happening throughout the week. Tickets are available at relation.com/festival. So we thank you again for your time. We hope to see you at the rest of the festival events, and stay safe, everyone. Have a good rest of the weekend. Bye.